Welcome to the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson. This is episode 19, and I'm going to be talking about correct words versus politically correct words. Now, I don't know how long this has been going on. Maybe for all of the human history, perhaps, since we've been talking. We have been changing words, adapting words, slowly evolving in our language. And that's a pretty natural process for that to happen. But I think what's happened lately is there's been an intentional change of language that is spurred on by groups of people that want to change the conversation about certain subjects. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons why people want them changed. But I think what we have to do, and what nobody seems to be really doing, is determining whether or not the changes are correct or incorrect. And the problem is that we've had this thing called politically correct. Now, mostly people call it woke, although I do think those concepts are different. But the idea behind politically correct is that you're using language that doesn't offend anyone. Now, that's pretty much an impossible task. And the reason it's impossible is that people take offense fairly easy without understanding what's being said to them. People are reacting to words that are perhaps not even the words that they think they are. The other problem is that often people get taunted or they are belittled or discriminated against, or someone is giving them very negative treatment, and they're using specific words at the same time. And instead of understanding that the negative treatment is the bad thing, what they do is they jump on the words that that person used, even though sometimes those words are actually correct. Now, that's a big problem. And I think that what it's led us to is very confusing language. There's a lot of people trying really hard to speak inoffensively and politically correctly. But the problem with that is that it will never work, because there's always going to be someone who is getting offended. There's always going to be someone who is taking the words the wrong way. Now, a lot of these changes in words have come about because they're trying to be correct. And, that can be a really good thing, especially if we were using an incorrect word and they're saying, oh, it's offensive because it's incorrect. Like, that's a really big difference. To be offensive because a word is incorrect versus to be offensive because a word has been used in a context that was offensive. So we really have to take apart these contexts that are offensive and stop pretending that if someone's being mean to you, that it's because of the words that they're using rather than the offense itself. Now, there's so many of them. I think the biggest changes that have happened, the most confusing changes, I definitely think have to do with queer theory. And queer itself is an offensive term. Like, it's saying that if you're gay or trans or whatever, that you're weird and that somehow that's wrong. So I would consider the term queer to be an offensive word. But with political correctness, it's not considered to be offensive. Now, people have even gone so far to say that words like homosexual is offensive. They're using the idea that correct words are offensive because somebody decided to get offended by it. This is a terrible problem, because homosexual is a correct word. It means same sex. So we can assume that must have something to do with same sex. Could be same sex attraction. Like, that's what the word means. So a lot of Latin-based words have come into common usage precisely because they're similar across different languages. Now, they don't always get used in the same way language to language. It can be a similar word. Now, I just want to get a little bit into that before I go into queer theory, to just sort of touch upon the idea of the changes in words from language to language. Now, we have a lot of that in French and English. Obviously, I'm Canadian. That's my bias. And so we have a lot of words that sound the same in French and English, but they don't actually have the same meaning. Chanter in French means to sing, but chanting, the same word that sounds the same in English, doesn't mean singing. It's a specific kind of singing or chanting. It's like a monotone type of thing that they do, like religiously. Marcher is walking. Well, in English, marching is a very specific kind of walking. It's when you march in a specific rhythm, often in a military style. You can see the theme here is that nice sounding words in French take on a darker meaning in English, and that could have to do with a conflict between French and English. But if we were to translate those words directly, we would get them wrong. So there's a whole bunch of examples of this kind of thing. So that's why it's really, really troublesome if you are trying to find offense in a language that you don't even speak, because it's very easy to find offense with another language that you're not even familiar with, especially if those people are mean to you on a regular basis, in which case you could perceive that everything they said is offensive and all of their words are offensive. And you can tell because you can just ask someone, if we are talking in a group, oh, do you find that word offensive? Do you find that word offensive? And you talk to different people in the same group, and they won't find it all offensive. Different people have very, very subjective interpretations of what's offensive. But if we look at the actual meaning, what you can find is that there is some terms that are offensive and some that aren't. Now, what about the term Caucasian? I think Caucasian is an offensive term when you're using it for Europeans. I also think that white is an offensive term because we're not actually white. And the Caucasus is not in Europe. This is something that's driven me crazy now for a few years because it's become so commonplace to call Europeans Caucasians and nobody seems to question it. And I don't know if that's just because the Eurocentric sort of ideology, which is now turned in on itself because now we have people that are either treating white people like they're special in a good way or white people special in a bad way. Either way, the specialness is the problem. We're not special. We're really, really not. Now get back to queer theory. Now the whole thing about queer theory that really drives me up the wall is that it's all about destroying language. The confusing part with queer theory becomes when they start to actually embrace the terms that are incorrect. So queer is incorrect, whether being homosexual or bisexual or transsexual or transgender or transvestite or any of those things, any of the things in the LGBTQ plus world, it doesn't have to be weird. Like, why would you encourage making it more weird? I don't understand that. Now, questioning these things has become such a hot button topic. Like, it's really, really hard to question these things that are happening, and yet they're becoming more and more absurd, and they're changing faster and faster, and they expect everyone to keep up with it, to change their language based on the latest thing. But the thing is, it will never stop changing, because if you base all of your language changes on the subjective interpretation of someone who got offended, then we won't have any words left to use at all, because everybody will be getting offended by some of the words. I think we really, really have to separate between the objective words, as I said, the correct words, and the sort of street terms or the slang. I'm not against slang. Slang has its place. It's with your friends. It's in a social context. But when you get into academics, we really need to understand that words do have meaning. And when we're using Latin-based words, it's so that other people in other languages will understand us better. So if we keep messing with those words, they're not going to mean anything. And if we decide that a correct word is offensive and we replace it with now an offensive term, we've now brought ourselves into a place where we have normalized offensive language and we have vilified correct language that isn't offensive, that's just very descriptive. Now, I think what's happening now too is the LGBTQ plus world, which I may or may not be a part of. I'm not really sure. It depends on how you define it. Because I'm not cisgendered. I definitely prefer androgyny, and I reject the idea that I need to label myself. Maybe you could say that I'm agender because I don't feel that I have a gender identity at all. So I'm certainly not cisgender. I'm very uncomfortable with cisgender. And I'm also uncomfortable with transgender. I don't want to be transgender. I don't want to be transsexual. I don't want to be a man. So I use she now, but I don't want to declare my pronouns for the reason that I don't think it's polite. I don't think that this is good etiquette. And I don't think that we are socially capable of changing in a way that can positively influence us if we start to normalize always announcing our pronouns. Now, I don't mind if someone does it. If you want to request your pronoun, I will go along with it. I'm not trying to stop people from doing it. What I'm saying is that I don't think that's a good direction to go in. And honestly, I have been messing up my pronouns a lot. Like, I do find it very confusing. I'm trying to learn new languages. Pronouns are a very basic part of our language. And when you start changing pronouns, you're changing something much more profound than what you might think. Words like the, if you started to change the, that's going to change a lot of our language. And yet we're just sort of casually changing pronouns as though that's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. So the best thing that we should be doing, and I read a really excellent article, and of course I lost track of it. I'm not sure who wrote it, but it was a long article about the evolution of pronouns. And the direction that we should be going in is towards one singular pronoun. If you look in the past, we had even more pronouns, royal pronouns, a lot of it has to do with status. So those kind of pronoun things come from a time when our cultures and our societies were run very differently. And if we want to move into an egalitarian society, which is what I do want an egalitarian society, then the way I see it is the only way to do that is to only have one pronoun, regardless of gender, and to only use one singular pronoun. Now, that very few people seem to be suggesting that, and I think the problem is that we've become very, very divided against each other, where we're either all for it or all against it. And I'm really sick of that. And I do believe we really need to be objective in order to communicate properly. And a lot of the people that are kicking up a fuss about these things are just not very educated people. So they're taking a personal offense at something because they simply don't like the word. That is subjective. And we have to reject when somebody says things like that. If somebody tells you that homosexual is an offensive term, you have to reject that because it's not, because it's just a word that's actually accurate. So it's a very strange position to be in. Now, there is a movement of people, again, within the LGBT and so on, the non-heteronormative world, because that's really what it is. It's just the people that don't fit into the normal heterosexual cisgendered world. And there's a hell of a lot of people, and we do not all have the same opinions, and we're not all on board with the changes that are happening. Gay, trans, you want to know why some of them are voting Republican and conservative? It's not because they want conservative. It's because the left wing has gone so insane that they can't be a part of it anymore, and it's actually harming people. Because if you can't communicate correctly, then you can't get anything done. And you're just sabotaging everyone's ability to get along with each other, and our social world is what is going to crumble and what's going to be ruined by this. And not only that, but it's created these camps of like yes and no and on our side and not on our side. And it's just so harmful to think that way. I don't like the word non-binary. I want to join the movement now that is going back to using the old words. We were using them in the 90s pretty much. Transsexual is someone who wants to change their sex and gender completely to the opposite. Transvestite is someone who likes to wear clothing of the opposite gender. Androgynous is just a person that has qualities of both male and female. Those are good terms. I like all of those terms, and I use those terms, and I reject the new terms. I reject using trans as a singular word. Trans is a part of a word. It's a part of a lot of words, transportation, transition. We use that because we know that it means change, to change from one thing to another. The new words are coming along at a time when humanity is objectively and verifiably getting much dumber. And I'm very concerned about this reduction in our collective intelligence because I think it's happening for a lot of reasons. I think pollution is one of them. I think IVF is one of them. I think technology is a big reason why we're getting more and more technology to try to think for us. What do you think is going to happen when we get all this technology to think for us? We're not going to be able to think anymore. The more that you use specialized language, the more that you change that language quickly, the less the rest of the world will understand you. You know, your little corner of Vancouver might have all these different changes and all these different things that they're saying. But if you're just changing it based on what someone told you to do, it's an incredible groupthink type of thing. A lot of the Orwellian ideas, in 1984, come up a lot with this kind of thing, and especially the term newspeak. Newspeak meaning like new speak, so new words. Newspeak is used as a way to confuse people about what you're talking about. Because if you replace a word that people find triggering or uncomfortable and you put a new word in there, then people will perceive it differently. So, newspeak is a clever way to manipulate people into believing that you've brought in a totally new conversation. We've reinvented the wheel over and over and over and over again. And we shouldn't be suspicious of those topics, which include a lot of terms that get constantly changed. And my biggest worry about every single change that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years, mostly in the last 20 years, is that it's made the conversation dumber and it's made it more confusing. And you can tell that the conversations get dumber because people argue only about the words. So they argue about what the words mean. You know, between sex and gender, like how many arguments have people had about what sex means and what gender means? Oh, there's only two genders, oh, there are only two sexes. Well, we made a definition of that a while ago. The one was biological sex on one head, and the other was the social gender part. So we already divided that. But people won't be satisfied with that division. They have to argue about it and they have to erase the lines because people genuinely believe when they confuse the language that they're somehow taking back from the oppressive control that other people have used with the language over them. But that's false because language is only meant to communicate. So long as you're using correct words, then there shouldn't be a problem. But the problem always seems to come from someone getting offended. So if I, as a European descended person, say I am offended by the use of the word Caucasian and I am offended by the use of the word white, because they are incorrect, still somehow has less validity because number one, I'm supposed to be from the oppressive group, so I'm not allowed to have an opinion and nobody's allowed to question it. You know, even though it's incorrect. And what about the real Caucasians? Like, what about the people from Azerbaijan and Armenia and from this actual area that exists? It's on the map. You can look it up. This is the thing that I'm saying is that we have to separate the slang context from the official news type language, from the academic language, which is supposed to be as clear as crystal. It's supposed to be totally transparent, that you understand what everyone is saying. So the more that you change words, the more that you're just completely erasing any ability to make sense. And what it's creating is a nonsense world. It's creating a world where nobody knows what anybody else is saying. And we're attacking people for using correct words and forcing them to use incorrect words based on somebody. And it's always just like one or a few people that decided to say something. It's the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's what keeps happening is the loud people, even though they're stupid, keep getting the attention and they get whole words shut down because the people that feel that they have to change things don't question those people enough. It's like if someone comes to you crying and crying and they're so upset about something, you want to help them, but you have to first determine what their problem is. What if the person says to you, my child just got murdered in front of me? That is awful. That's like one of the worst things that could happen. Their crying makes sense. You need to help this person. But what if this person instead says, I didn't get the silver Porsche. My dad bought me the black Porsche and I didn't want it. Well, that's a very different situation, isn't it? But people cry about both of those things as though they're the same things because they don't have perception, because people's experience of life is so different. A lot of people cry for nothing. It's sad to say, but some people, they just impulsively cry. So people's emotional reactions don't always equate to the thing that's really happening in their life. And what the problem is now is that everybody's treating those crying people, the one that's crying over their child dying, another one that's crying over getting the wrong Porsche, and treating that crying like it's the same thing. And that's a big, big problem. And I think that's what's happening with language, is that someone is saying, I find this word offensive, but I don't find this other word offensive. But what that is just their subjective interpretation. We really, really need to look at and examine the actual words and what they mean. Why is nobody doing that? Why is nobody looking for actually correct words? Asian, I mean, that's so general. We have clearly very, very different groups of people living in Asia that look nothing like each other, and yet we're supposed to just assume that that's one group of people because we have this really wonky, misdivided line between two not real continents in Eurasia when it's actually just Eurasia. It's just Eurasia. It's one continent. It's still connected to Africa, but it's clearly one continent. I mean, even the division between Europe and Asia is in a part that's like, it's very wide. It doesn't make any sense. I've been there. I've seen the river that supposedly divides Europe and Asia. It's a joke. There are bigger rivers elsewhere, and they don't divide a continent. It's an absurdity, and yet we've just accepted these absurdities. We can't seem to figure out that words have meaning, and we need to focus on what that meaning is if we're going to get it right. Now, I don't think anybody ever got offended by the word Native American. I think the people that got offended by that were honestly not even Native American. They were Europeans who were resentful of the fact that they are settlers. They didn't want to be called settlers, and so they changed it. So now it's like this different word, and it just causes so much confusion. So I mean, the thing is, I feel like what we need is a bigger movement, and I want to, like I said, I want to join the movement that is using transsexual, transvestite, homosexual, and androgynous as perfectly acceptable terms. Same with hermaphrodite. Someone said, "Well, don't you know that's offensive?" It's not offensive. The word hermaphrodite means Hermes and Aphrodites, which are two Greek gods that represent the essence of these two masculine and feminine types. It's not offensive. Androgynous is not offensive. Now, people take a liking to words for whatever reason. They say, I don't like the word androgynous. You don't have to like it. That's fine. But it still means something. It's still a correct word. So take away that subjective, I feel offended by this or whatever, because if you have no reason to be offended by that actual word, then stop taking offense to it because you're the problem. And we just keep taking in all these different voices as though they're all equal, and they're not. Some people have an educated opinion about it and they know what they're talking about, and some people don't. But we're giving all these people the same credit because we feel like if somebody said it, then it just automatically is. So I want to do that too now. I want to get people to stop using white and black. I want people to start using European, African, use those terms that are actually accurate to the geography because that's the best that we can do. We know that there are these ancient lineages that go back into these different places. So why wouldn't we use that at the core? And then I think the other thing too that happens that confuses people when they start, especially when they talk about ethnicity, is culture. So we've now mixed up culture with ethnicity, and these are very, very different things. Lately, because it's not so cool to be European, so a lot of people that look completely European will say, well, I, as a brown person or even as a black person, because one of their ancestors was not European. Well, what does that mean then? Why are we using these colored terms? Why are we using brown and black if they're not the actual colors that people actually are? So we have so much confusion right now about how to talk about each other. And I'm just talking about English right now. I don't even know how to get into other languages. I'm sure it's just as crazy with different languages and how to use that as well. What I really, really want to see and what I really want to encourage is correct words. Put away this idea that somebody getting offended by something is the problem. The people that are getting offended by correct language are those crying people about the Porsche. You don't need to take them seriously. They don't have a good perception of reality. They don't know what real suffering is. They don't know what real offense is. I read a thing as a disabled person that said that cripple is considered to be an offensive term. Crip is considered to be perfectly fine and an acceptable word. And I reject that completely. I think that's totally absurd. I mean, yes, cripple is considered to be an offensive term. I would take that offensively, but crip is even worse. That's even worse. The more they go into the slang, the more you get into a kind of talk that you need to figure out with your social group and with your group of friends in your dialect, in your location. But don't drag that into academia. And that's why academia, I think, is falling apart. I think we're going to start seeing more and more universities just collapse in those areas, especially in the social sciences and the social studies, because it's very hard to apply science to social and human behavioral things. That's what I've gone over before. That most of the psychological studies that are done are not repeatable because human behavior changes so dramatically from one instance to another. And a lot of the times that they're doing studies, they're studying very, very abstract ideas. Conscientiousness is one that comes up. I don't believe that that is a real quality that can be measured at all, because so much of that is based on culture and how you perceive your culture. What's conscientious in one culture can be considered to be very different in another one. That's just to say that those are the kind of abstract words that we pretend we can be scientific about. And we've taken that sort of abstract, vague ideology and applied that to words that have very real meaning. It has to do with accuracy again. It has to do with accuracy. And the problem with the identity politics that have come up a lot is they made it so subjective that you can claim to be whatever you want. And that goes against the basic principles of reality. And I honestly think that that is part of the problem, is that a lot of people genuinely don't believe in an objective reality. And so they're so lost in language that they're just pulling from this language and that language, thinking they can make up whatever the hell they want. And I just disagree with that completely. I do think that there is a time and place for that subjective, inward, personal reality, your own creative visions, your little fantasy world. We all have that. But you have to understand, too, that there is also an objective reality that's shared. And if you want to be compassionate, you want to be an empathetic person, you have to be able to understand that that objective reality exists. And if people are telling you that they're upset about a word that someone said, but that word is actually accurate, then maybe instead of just overreacting and saying we can't use that word anymore, it's offensive, to actually question what they found offensive about it. And maybe that person will actually change their mind and say, you know what? I was wrong. I perceived that word as the offense, but actually this other person was just being mean to me. And to understand that that person was the problem that was bothering you, and not the word that they use, if that word in fact is correct. I think I got to the end of it. There's an awful lot of words out there that we are being pushed to use that are incorrect. Let's just try to keep words real. It's really depressed me a lot to see the changes that have happened, because I want gay, transsexual people, anybody who's not heteronormative, to be completely accepted in society and to have everybody be accepting of each other. That's the goal. The goal really is equality. For women, for different ethnicities, we want equality. But we can't have a conversation about gender and race and all these other things if we can't use accurate words to really describe what we're talking about. And I think that's where science can help us, because science is all about objectivity. So we have to look at what are the correct words. And you have to understand that one person in a group does not represent the whole group. I do not represent all European descended people. I do not represent all women. I don't represent the whole non-binary group. I don't really represent anyone but myself. And I think that's where our society in general and where identity politics has messed us up, is that it's put those things in too high of a position, and it's made it harder for us to communicate, to just be yourself in the moment and to stop labeling people so much. Because the more that you label yourself, the more you're bound to label other people as well. So it's not about shutting down the conversation. It's about knowing when to have the conversation. If you want to look up what Caucasian means, like Google it. Like, how do we have Google now and nobody uses it? Drives me crazy. Community is one of them. If a bunch of people with the same trait exist, it does not mean that they are in a community. Stop calling people with the same trait a community. This community implies that they are communing with each other, that are communicating with each other. And I think that is where this whole problem has started with incorrect language, because people have assumed that every group of people with similar traits are hanging out with each other, and they're not. And so they assume if they're hanging out with each other, they all have their little world. And you talk to one of those people and they say, yeah, we consider midget to be an offensive term. But there was no vote. There was no collective agreement that that was or wasn't an offensive term. The people were told to be offended. They were told that that was an offensive term. And now you're saying, oh, that's considered offensive, even though you were not even offended. So all these people are being unoffended on the behalf of one single person that was just too dumb to understand what the word meant. Thank you for your time. This has been the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson.